So our talk is focused on regenerative agriculture and how these practices may be appropriate for a context such as the Portuguese. My name is Juan Pablo Rodal. Oh, a bit on what the topic will be about, the structure of the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Regenerative is doing. This is the company that I'm working for, and that is in collaboration with Marc's project. We're going to talk a bit on regenerative agriculture, what it is, what it isn't, a few of the ecological principles that it is based on, and then talk about system integrations within regenerative agriculture and the different types of farming systems that regenerative agriculture can do. And finally, a Q&A session with Marc to talk about his experiences on the farm, in which you guys will also be a participant as well. I'm sure you will have questions, but please try to keep them for this section in the end. So, well, my name is Juan Pablo. I'm from Colombia. My background is in business and economics, but through my passion in nature, I decided to work with agriculture and have been working since for the past 5 years. And Marc, please.
My name is Marc. I am German, but I grew up for the most part in the US. I returned to Germany with 18 years old, and I then went on after quite some time searching what I wanted to do to study agriculture. With 20 years I started, and now half a year ago I finished, but already for 1.5 years I've been running a project. It's about 100 kilometers away from here in the Alentejo, of setting up a regenerative agroforestry farm in a degraded pasture land.
So I'm going to be talking about also what Regenerative is and what it's doing. Regenerative is basically a startup, a growing startup within the regenerative agriculture landscape or industry. It is aiming or specializing in facilitating the transition from conventional to regenerative agriculture, and it does so as well, trying to communicate and making this concept of regenerative a mainstream concept, a concept that all understand and know how to implement. The mission is to regenerate 100 million hectares by 2030, and in the process supports approximately 10 million farmers. And although that may sound like a lot, it's just 2% of global agriculture. The approach that Regenerative follows is based on a step-by-step process where the client's vision and objectives are watered down to what they need and what they can do through a technical advisory. Eventually, a pilot project or model farm is designed and implemented to test these ideas. And through a model school, the learnings that are achieved through the pilot project are then scaled into the rest of the space. This happens through transition packages that create the tools and the knowledge for the capacity building to happen. And eventually, Regenerative also helps by connecting this produce with off-takers that can purchase this produce as well. The first or the main core principles that Regenerative is using in terms of regenerative agriculture, and we will see why there's many, and it's still an ongoing discussion about this. But for Regenerative, the most important ones, or the 5 most important ones, are first and foremost to restore soil health by keeping the soil covered, either through mulching or green manures or green plants and biodiversity. Secondly, is to increase diversification within the farm system. This involves increasing crop biodiversity or integrating animals and livestock within the space. Thirdly, it is to phase out or reduce the dependency on the inputs that farming systems usually have in order to become much more resilient with what the ecosystem can provide. Fourth, ensuring food security for the producers and also the people that are impacted by this production system. And finally, or last but not least, is the economic viability of these projects. There's a lot to be done creatively, but if it doesn't have an economic structure, it is most probably not going to be sustainable in the long term. Currently, Regenerative is working with over 30 projects across the globe that add up to almost 41,000 hectares and are supporting around 3,500 farmers. Most of the operations happen within a tropical context in South America, Africa or Central Africa, and Southeast Asia. And now, or lately, some projects have been developing in Europe that Regenerative is collaborating with, such as Marc's and another one in France. Regenerative goal, or at least not the goal, but the way in which they're working is by approaching large institutions and companies that probably already have high or really big supply chains within the food industry and that are creating potentially a lot of negative impact. And these companies have also identified that the business as usual, conventional practices are not enough to sustain their business models. And in addition to that, also see the power of restoration within regenerative agriculture as well. So some of these companies you might have heard of. Yeah, very, very interesting, the array. So now a little bit of what regenerative agriculture is and what is actually effective. So the practices in regenerative agriculture have lately gained a lot of prominence as a way to restore soil health and also provide what can be considered as future-proof agriculture with these impending risks of climate change, droughts, and loss of fertility, etc. The term has been around for at least 30 years, but recently this has had a tremendous spike. Nevertheless, the concept is still not yet defined. So what is regenerative agriculture, or better yet, what is it effective for? So FAO has very publicly stated that resource-intensive agriculture has stopped to be, or is not a way to deliver sustainable food in the long term. This is basically because even though these systems are based on high inputs and technology, the return on that investment is not really being seen. The growths for selected crop yields, for example, these are just some of the main ones, like wheat, maize, or soybeans and sugarcane, have showed a tendency of decreased yields over time. This is right after 1965 until 2015. At the same time, intensification and all these investments on the land in terms of technology and inputs have sort of sustained them, but then the levels of fertility and degradation are still falling and they're not being restored. So this is an impending risk from a historical point of view. But as a projected point of view, and also what is coming from the future in terms of climate change or climate variability, it shows that the effect, although the effect on the yield change for some of these crops will have a positive and a negative, the net effect will be mostly negative from just the next decade, 2030 and 2049. So the problem is that the erratic climate patterns are affecting the ways in which plants have been historically adapted to reproduce and to create the biomass and create the foodstuffs that we require. And although the CO2 effect can positively impact the development of these plants, the drought and the loss of fertility in the ground, and also sometimes even floods, will affect the amount of produce that can be produced. So basically, the bottom line is that farmers will face serious, very, very serious challenges this decade. As we have discussed, soil health is collapsing. Increased input costs in what they use in terms of chemical fertilizer, pesticides, and also water is becoming much more expensive. And these systems are dependent, the profitability of the systems are dependent on also this cost factor. So the higher the cost, the higher the risk of developing these types of methodologies. At the same time, monocultures are eradicating biodiversity and are reducing the capacity of the ecosystem to store water and to infiltrate the water that comes, affecting not only the levels of moisture in the ground, but also the fertility as well. So feedbacks into why the soil is collapsing. And finally, as we just saw, how the climate will affect these crop yields in the future. So at least what we can say is that before we define it is that regenerative is going beyond sustainability. We have seen that practices such as monoculture, deforestation, and chemical reuse have degenerating characteristics, and anything that is sustainable or maintains a status quo that is not working is also not beneficial. So we need to look for methodologies that help to restore and regenerate the damage that we have created in order to maintain our ways of life. Arguably, that also need to be changed, but at least to restore the damage that we have done. So the first step is also to understand the objectives that the farmer or the company has. Once these are identified, and they can be very, very different from this, but for example, recovering biodiversity, or reducing market risk, or increasing productivity, or enhancing climate resilience, you then go to select from an array of practices that have been proven to have a regenerative capacity, such as increasing tree diversity, or mulch for soil cover, or integrating livestock, or phasing out or minimizing chemical pesticide use. But at the same time, regenerative agriculture is much more than the practice. It is an outcome-based approach that needs to be measured, and of which, when done correctly, can have a synergistic effect amongst these outcomes, create a compound effect that eventually creates the resilience of the ecosystem. So just as an example, just by increasing crop biodiversity within a space, quite straightforwardly, you increase the diversity and abundance of the plants within the space, which through root systems improve soil structure. And when soil structure is benefited, biological activity is enhanced. When biological activity is enhanced and diversified, the nutrient cycling is accelerated and it is more readily available, which ends up affecting increased plant diversity in itself and allows for more plants to be there in the space. This, of course, create other virtuous cycles amongst these other outcomes. And although these are not yet ready to be completely or fully measured, there is a vast understanding that this is the effect. So some of the proponents have said that regenerative agriculture cannot be defined, and this boils down to the fact that it is also evolving. We have just discussed the functional elements of what regenerative agriculture can do, but as we will see forward, also with Marc's talk, integrating further these practices and considering a system not as a part but as a whole within the ecosystem, also designing for multi-reciprocity and connecting the farmers and the different farms within the rest of the farm ecosystems that also do the same thing, can create this resiliency and a bigger network. So now we're going to talk a little bit on the ecological principles that these practices are based on. Fundamentally also about plant and soil dynamics. So basically in nature happens in stages. Marc will talk a little bit further on this as we go, so I'm just going to skip through this. If done in a natural succession, this will take hundreds of years to achieve, but interventions that respect the context can actually accelerate and shift this process, even though the stages, even if the stages are different. The second concept is niche complementarity, and basically what this means is nature requires competition to thrive. It has followed a history, nature has followed, let's say, a history of coexistence. Plants are rarely have a history of isolation, and those that do also might not be the best to include within a regenerative design. But if you have this coexistence, by inducing density and diversity within the space, these plants have to select which traits to specialize on, such as root systems, leaves and stems, or reproductive systems and seeds. And what this does is basically creates higher resource efficiency of soil and fertilizer, water, sun, and avoids plant laziness. This basically turns into another concept, which is stratification and layering, and this is what happens above ground as well, specifically. And this is basically plants that are sort of the different nature of these plants try to follow the different pockets where they thrive in best. And there is a right mix of this if you want to design your own ecosystem, of which Marc will also talk about later. Rise of deposition then follows the fact that once these systems are highly optimized to capture the sun's energy, all of the carbon sugars, all the carbon that is extracted from the air is pumped down into the soil to deposit as carbon sugars that feed the life ecosystem in the soil, and which eventually close the loop of energy and nutrient how do you say transfer. Then finally, is ecosystem services. This is of course a really trendy also word, but it is very important to understand the value that these ecosystem services have, not only for human function, but for ecosystem resilience. Once these ecosystem services are in place, they will, of course, directly and indirectly benefit humans and our social welfare and our farm ecosystems. So now we're going to talk about what these system integrations look like, and the different approaches and methodologies that, or at least the most common ones that you've probably heard of. But it's really important to mention that we've just talked about the functional approach of regenerative agriculture that has, it is based on practices, function and impact. Practices such as the ones we've described before, impact such as regenerating soil or recovering biodiversity, and then also reversing climate change. And then, yes, and of course the benefit in social welfare and well-being. But there are the second level that we want to talk about here is the integrative regenerative agriculture that goes beyond just the functional or just the farm as a part within the ecosystem and considers these as a whole in terms of water flows, biodiversity, and integration. These are also systems that are designed in a way that integrate as many functions as possible, as we will see in a little bit, where human creativity is the limit and which can potentially create ecosystems that have such abundance that well, scarcity is not a problem anymore. Usually, conventional agriculture deals with these three elements, crops, forests, and livestock, in a separate way. But in integration, in the first level of integration, you get, for example, an integrated crop forest, which we'll see later how that could look like. And then on a further level of integration, an integrative level of integration, you could potentially have an integrated crop livestock forest, all within the same space. So functional and integrative. There has been studies, this one was done in the Cerrado ecosystem, as Marc mentioned, is a semi-arid context. It's very close to what the Portuguese context is. And conventional approaches in terms of emissions of cattle, fuel, water, air emissions, fertilizers, and other emissions like transportation, etc., have shown to have a higher impact, conventional. And integrated systems that include livestock forest and just livestock and crops, and then also integrated with conventional, have way less impact in general. So now in terms of the types of agroforestry, of regenerative systems, and agroforestry is a big one. It is a word that a lot of people are using nowadays, and it basically deals with tree integration within the farming ecosystem. But they can be very different from each other. So it's really good to understand that there are different types of agroforestry systems within themselves. You might have agri-silvicultural, you might have a silvopastoral, you might have an agro-silvopastoral. And then this is basically, for example, how an agroforestry system that is an agri-silvicultural or integrated crop forest could look like. And what this means is between a line of trees, you have an alley of crops that can be annual or perennial in this case, such as vines. And you have trees that provide a function of shade and soil structure, and also enhancing biological activities that benefit the vines as well. So in this case, the timber can be harvested after the trees have matured, and you can renovate the system in this way. But there are dynamics and synergies between these two crops benefiting instead of actually extracting from each other. So as we saw before, basically flourishing is mutual and complementarity is absolutely essential. Another model is the silvopastoral, which is including livestock with trees in this case. A lot of people have said that the way that we obviously consume meat is not sustainable at all, and maybe not even ethical. But some may argue that actually having livestock within these ecosystems is one of the ways in which you can regenerate the land even faster. Through pasture land that is combined with trees, you can create very deep root structure systems that infiltrate water and restore water, the storage capacity, benefit the biological, enhance the biological activity in the ground from all the bacteria that is coming from the animals themselves. Of course, providing shade to the animals, which would give a much better quality for any type of product that you could get from the livestock. But at the same time, benefit the tree systems, in this case cherries, that will produce, will have less incidence in terms of pests and less requirements in terms of fertilizer, etc. And then finally, the last level of integration, which is agro-silvopastoral. This is an example of what it could look like. Having an agroforestry system as a tree line that is productive in itself, with cacao trees and nut trees. You have other leguminous plants that fix nitrogen into the soil, but that can feed the cattle. Also a diverse set of cover crops that would provide different types of nutrition for the cattle and a more enhanced biodiversity within the space, and which will eventually create a much more resilient ecosystem overall. These systems have been studied in Brazil quite strongly and for more than 40 years now. This is a case as well in the Brazilian Cerrado from the same study as I was showing you before. And they decided to calculate how much land they would require to produce enough food for a 7-year period, which is the maturity cycle of the timber, in this case teak, so it's a very common exercise. And basically what they from their calculations, it involves I'll remember the concept later, but basically it's how much of the same, so on a hectare of conventional land, for example, of just cattle, you would produce 1 unit of cattle. Or if it's trees, 1 unit of trees. In an integrated space, you will produce probably 0.3 of what you could produce in a single space. But in this same space, you can produce 0.7 of maize, and you can produce 0.3 of livestock. So in aggregate, we're talking about, I forgot the numbers, but more than 1 as a unit. So this is how this can be transferred into an integrated system. So what this exercise concludes is that in a space that might be 5 times less than what you would use to provide the same amount of food, you can achieve this, or the same target, but at the same time have all these ecosystemic services that are absolutely fundamental to the biosphere and to our way of life. So, do you want to go straight, or do you want to?
Yeah, maybe everybody just stand up a moment, shake themselves, just to refresh. The other way, but don't fall down. All right, stand still. All right, we're ready. Independent of our studies, to make an agroforestry farm close to our university. And I think that was also kind of the first steps of the Regenerative Foundation, because it was co-founded by one of my best friends from university. And yeah, we made this group together, 4 people, and we started involving students from our university and so on and so forth. And then through all of this, I got to know this man named Ernst Götsch, who I will be getting back to in just a moment. But first, there was still one more, before I really get into what I do and what I'm so passionate about, I'll still give one more brief explanation about this one other concept of regenerative agriculture, or in this case, the ICL, so the integrated crop and or integrated forest and livestock, no?
No, so holistic management, the ICO would be crop livestock, but this can be crop zero
systems, which is true. These really super intensive animal farms are one of the biggest crimes that humanity has made on our planet up to date. We've done a lot of really questionable and criminal things, but I think that these livestock farms should be among the top 2 or 3. So the whole animal sector has gotten a really bad image, and the animals themselves as well. But in reality, they could be some of the agents to really help us regenerate large-scale ecosystems on a really, really fast manner. And so in the conventional livestock sector, you have really 2 realities. The one is the super intensive, where you put the animals in a small area, all of them concentrated on the same spot. Because there's so many animals, there's no more pasture, there's nothing for them to eat. All the food comes from outside. You get them water and food from outside, and they just stand in these poop lagoons that you have to scoop off the poop every now and again and eat the crap that you bring them from somewhere else. Then there's the extensive systems, which you see a lot here in Portugal, which is just large areas of land that are, and the livestock can just roam on it as they wish. And both of them are equally bad for the ecosystem in different senses, but the extensive livestock system is bad in the sense that it promotes a very bad selection of herbs to continue growing, and actually also causes a big impoverishment in the plant biodiversity in the pastures. and also can be very disruptive to natural regeneration cycles of trees, for example, which is the reality here in Portugal. Most of these extensive livestock farms are operating in these kind of open oak savannas, where you have the large oak trees above and then the pastures below. And we have a big problem here nowadays because most of the oak trees are really old and a lot of them are ill. They have a lot of wounds, they're rotten from the inside, but there's no young trees to replace them because the livestock always, as they pass, they take them away. And you have this problem because imagine if this was here now a pasture, this room, and you had 2 cows in here. The first thing they would do is they would eat all the herbs that they like the most. Like all the most delicious stuff, they get it. The next day, all the stuff they like the most is already gone. And, well, the plants are pruned, let's say. You know, they prune the plants, they don't kill them. And so after 2 or 3 days, they get a bit bored. They see some trees standing around and they want to punish the humans that put them in this little cage, in this little prison. They start knocking off some trees, because there's one parable that Ernst, the man that I did my apprenticeship with, he always gives. We put the animals in these terrible conditions so that we can put them in our frying pan, and in compensation, because everything in life has compensation, in compensation the animal puts us in hell.
In what?
Hell.
Hell.
So it creates this paradise that our earth could be. Our actions, as a consequence of our actions, we have turned our paradise into hell. And yeah, so I'll continue. And you have, well, what I was still explaining is, so on the 3rd day, on the 4th day, those plants that the cow had pruned in the 1st day, the ones it likes to eat the most, will have started resprouting. But the cow, as it's still on the same spot, will eat those again. The plants that the cow doesn't like, or likes less, it has never touched. And so the plants that the cow likes the most are frequently getting pruned and actually starting to die off because they cannot actually recover from the pruning. And then the plants that the cow does not like so much, they continue standing, they start flowering, they start seeding, and the plants that the cow actually likes doesn't produce seed, and the pasture starts being more and more composed of the plants the cow actually doesn't like. That's also true for other animals. And so this holistic management system is really based on the idea that you have really small areas. You put a lot of animals in there. This is kind of always a bit calculated, like they make a study of the site, of the pasture, how healthy and how good it is, and then how much area do we need for our cattle. And then they put them in there for 6 or 12 or 24 hours. Usually it's maximum 24 hours, and they move it to the next spot. You see here, this is where the cattle had already been. Now, right now they're here. The next day they would go here. The next day here. The next day here. And so it's a really intensive system where the cows, they clear out everything. They prune all the plants that are there. The ones that they don't actually eat, they step on them, they bend them over. They leave a lot of poop behind, and then they are rotated to the next parcel, and they don't go back here for another half a year or more, so that the pasture can fully recover. You stop having problems with parasites and other diseases in the cow. The pasture starts getting much, much more productive, much richer. And the farmers that do this, that apply this system, usually have to start increasing the amount of cattle per hectare that they have. Whereas before they were having problems with lack of productivity from the pasture, now they have a problem that they don't have enough cows to eat all the pasture that is all of a sudden growing. And so, yeah, that's just a brief description of a subject that is very, very interesting. And so if you imagine that now here there was rows of trees, some of these trees edible to the cows as well, and the cows were being rotated through these fields, it would create even a new image again. And that's one of my big visions here for the Alentejo, for Portugal, because we have these really big areas that are like these open savannas, these oak savannas, and a lot of cattle. Most farmers here have cattle, and this is actually an amazing tool that we could have a big impact on large areas of land with relatively low labor costs, and especially if we start introducing more trees with this kind of system together, it could be really promising. So yes, what I actually ended up studying as a result of my agricultural, well, I studied conventional agriculture, but then got me really interested into this approach of agroforestry. And through this, I got to know this man named Ernst Götz, who for the past 35 years has been working on this specific piece of land in Bahia, Brazil. And so 35 years ago, when he got to this farm, which was originally registered in the notaries in the nearby village as Fazenda Olhos d'Água, you did not see a single tree. This was all wasteland, a small desert. And the previous owner had actually changed the name. This was the original name, Fazenda Olhos d'Água, which was given to places with a lot of humidity, a lot of dew, a lot of rain, and a lot of water springs, because it's the eye of the water. So Fazenda means farm, Olhos means eye, d'Água means of the water, so farm of the eyes of the water. So it's the eye of the water, where water is born. And when the previous owner finished deforesting and burning the land, he had a sawmill. He would collect the timber and he would bring it to the sawmill. He would burn the forest that was growing again to have cattle, to have cassava plantations. And he did that until really the point that nothing more grew. The soils had become so degraded that they were actually toxic to plants. Plants could not grow there anymore, except some really adapted ferns to soils with super low pH and these toxic levels of certain minerals. And the previous owner at that point then changed the name of the farm to Fazenda Fugidos da Terra Seca, which means as much as farm of the fugitives of the dry soil. So the previous owner had bought a farm called Fazenda Olhos d'Água, and he transformed it into a Fazenda dos Fugidos da Terra Seca. And so now Ernst, he bought the Fazenda dos Fugidos da Terra Seca and turned it into Olhos d'Água again. Within 1 year, he replanted all 500 hectares of the farm with forest, 111 hectares of which he planted to cacao production. He did many different experiments there. He's of a scientific background. He used to work in a plant breeding laboratory in Switzerland. And out of his experiments and his work resulted this farm, which, as I already mentioned, is about 500 hectares big. At the time, it was considered one of the most degraded pieces of land within the large region. Nowadays, it's considered the most healthy and biodiverse ecosystem and the place with the highest photosynthetic rate within the whole of the Atlantic rainforest region, which is a region that goes all the way from the south of the east coast of Brazil, all the way of the south of the east coast of Brazil, to all the way in the north of the east coast of Brazil. It's an area that covers 1,300,000 square kilometers. And nowadays, the scientists consider his 500 hectares to be the most biodiverse, the most healthy, and highest in photosynthesis of all these millions of square kilometers.
How many years?
30. At the same time, he is producing 3 times more cacao than the average conventional cacao farmer in Brazil. Per hectare per year. So you see, like down here, this really super green area is actually the area where he's still farming and still doing the maintenance. All of this he's turned into a natural reserve. These are also cacao plantations, but he at a certain time decided that 111 hectares was too much for him to do by himself. He was at the time working with a lot of employees, and he decided he wanted to do by himself to stop having employees. And he took here an area of 5 hectares and the rest he put into a natural reserve. And you really see the difference of the green from here to here. I don't know if you notice it, but it's when you're walking through it, it's really evident. The cacao trees here in these regions maybe have 1 fruit per tree, maybe 2 or 3. Here they will have 50 or 60, which just has to do with the maintenance of the forest that he does. And he has there a lot of other fruit trees as well for his own consumption. He has a lot of bananas, the best bananas I've ever eaten. Even in Brazil, where bananas are typically much better than here, if I would buy bananas in the market, I would always be, I would not be satisfied. I would always want to, yeah, the bananas from there were much better. And a lot of other fruits, açaí, cupuaçu, marang, jaca, the list goes on and on and on. Many things that have all these crazy exotic names, but a lot of them are from the Amazon, some are Asian, some are from the Atlantic rainforest. And well, when he started, there's another interesting fact that I'm going to mention, and that is how his work has impacted the climate of the site. So the original rainforest that was there, there's climate data that have recorded that it would receive 2,600 millimeters of rain per square meter per year. After the deforestation, the rain decreased to 1,100 millimeters per square meter per year, so it dropped by more than half. And nowadays, on his farm, it rains 2,400 millimeters per square meter per year again. So he's been able to more than double the amount of rain through his intervention here. He has, on a lot of days, I used to live here in this little house, and a lot of days when I would be walking from here to here, there would be rain, but you would look up and there's no clouds, and it's really like, there's only a rain like here in this area. Like here's already not raining. Then you have a lot of days that is raining really heavy here in all of this, but 2 kilometers away it's already not raining. You have there, even in the dry season, when it's not raining, so he passes through a period of 1 or 2 or 3 months a year, it depends on the year, where it's not raining. And in that time of the year, there's a lot of condensation on the trees. Like every morning you will wake up, and while it's still dark and you're just listening, you will think it's actually raining. And you go outside with a flashlight and you just realize that there's so much condensation on the leaves of the trees that it's dropping so fast and it's such big drops that it sounds like it's raining, but there's no water falling from the sky. So the whole farm has its own water cycle, and that's something super important to understand, is that in this farming system we really try not to work with water retention, with water reserves or anything like this. We really work with a water cycle. Water is a living entity that has, and its cycle has to be respected. If you think about water and the planet Earth, water to the planet is just like blood is to us. And the second you start blood, in order for it to be able to self-maintain its metabolism, so its metabolic processes, all the cells that are present within the blood, it has to follow these really specific movements. The second that you would straighten out your arteries or put lakes or boundaries on them, the blood in your vessels, in your arteries, in your veins would start to perish. And you as well. And so if we want to think about water management, we should really be thinking about how could we manage our agricultural systems, our ecosystems, in a manner that they promote and revitalize the water cycle, and not how can we build little retention hills and little retention dams to stop the water from flowing and maintaining itself healthy. Also temperature-wise, within his farm, on an average day, is about 8 to 10 degrees Celsius cooler than in the outside. And in the dry season, a lot more humidity in the air during the day. Well, this place, these videos, they were just supposed to be for the sound, but it's not very, you cannot actually hear it. I drew a lot of inspiration from the work that he was doing there, not just from the fact of what was growing there, how the plants were, but also his relationship with the plants, how he was interacting with the place, and what this must all mean to him. And this whole lifestyle behind it, growing your own food in a manner that actually follows the dynamics of life and the flow of life, and that here in this video I'm seeding corn, but what you don't see is that on the same place, before putting the corn, there was a forest that I cut down, and then together with the corn, I planted many different trees per square meter. Every square meter, about 20 or 30 trees. This I will get back to later. Seems a bit strange. All trees by seed, nothing by plant. Directly by seed to the place.
When he was starting to regenerate, he also seed or did he plant?
Everything by seed.
Did he prep the soil in any way?
So the story that he tells us is, or tells me, is that he would work from 7 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon with his workers, preparing the soil, preparing the land. At 4 till 6 until it gets dark, he would prepare all his seeds at home. You go home, sleep. 2 in the morning, go back to the field with a little oil lamp, because there was no flashlights then, and start planting and seeding everything, because he was really making scientific documentation of how he was planting everything, the different arrangements, different spacings.
Was there a significance to the 2 a.m. or that just to save time?
That was just the time he had, because at 6 in the morning he had to go with the employees again. So at 2 a.m. he didn't want the employees to plant, because they would put the beans like 10 centimeters off in that direction, or they wouldn't put it like immediately where he wanted. And so he would go that early in the morning to plant everything, and then at 6 in the morning go have breakfast with his family, and at 7 work with the workers again. And that's how within 1 year he planted those 500 hectares with not a single machine, not anything. This was in '84 when they did this. Nowadays, when you walk through some of his plantations, this what it looks like, really vitality, really green, really lush, everything. All the plants are super healthy. He doesn't use compost, he doesn't use manure, he doesn't use rock dust, he doesn't use chemical fertilizers, no pesticides, no fungicides, no herbicides. It's really just working with the plants. No inoculations, nothing, just working with plants. And a knowledge of how to optimize this plant's metabolic processes so that all of them stay this healthy, and how to, because each one of these different species, they have co-evolved to complement each other. And the understanding of how they grow together and how to maintain this right context between them so that the cacao doesn't get too tall or the jackfruit doesn't make too much shade. So maintaining this balance within the ecosystem so that every plant out of itself can feel itself well just because of the context that it's placed in. And that's really what the core of his whole quest and research was. When he was working in breeding, he was working to breed clover plants that were resistant to the rising toxicity in the air because of the airplane pollution. Because the native clover plants, they started suffering with the airplane pollution. And so he was breeding clover plants that would be resistant to the pollution. And he then one day asked himself if it would not be more intelligent if we created conditions for the plants to feel well, instead of looking for traits in plants that made them resistant to our mistreatment. And so he started looking for how can I give my plants the conditions that make them feel well, instead of looking for traits in plants that make them resist our mistreatment. Here's another picture of these cacao plantations, and you can see all the condensation of water that happens there in the early mornings. And this is already when the sun is rising, but just before it's really like just running off. It's like drip, 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 drip from all the different leaves. It makes a sound like it's raining. And really incredible phenomenon that has a lot to do with the layering of the forest and the maintenance that he does, which I will get back to later. When he arrived, there was originally 18 water springs on the land that had all dried out. There was no more water in the creeks. Nowadays, all of them are flowing the whole year round, even in the driest of the dry seasons when all the neighbor springs and creeks dry out. He has water. And as I said already, very, very healthy plants. Now we'll make a really short description of what like the basic characteristics of this form of agriculture are, which the main one is like that the plantations we plant, that they take the shape of agro-ecosystems which mimic the original and natural ecosystem of the site in structure, function, and dynamic. Structure in terms of layers, so the stratification. Function includes the nutrient cycling, water cycling, creating all the different niches for all the different insects, for the birds, for all of these processes, and then also the regulatory function that the forests and the biosphere have in regards to the rest of the planet and maintaining a stable climate. Dynamics refers to the dynamics that occur between the different life cycles of the forest, and the dynamic that occurs between the moments when you have a more open forest after pruning and a more shaded and closed forest after the forest has recovered from the pruning. So in this form of agriculture we work a lot with really radical prunings to re-stimulate plants' growth cycles. And the second one is plantations, which are highly productive in terms of quantity, but as well as in quality of the products that we harvest, and are economically viable both for our pockets, but also for the ecosystem of the site, and have a positive net contribution to the quantity and quality of consolidated life on the site. So that with every intervention we make, the biodiversity is benefiting, and the quality of life that so we have more biodiversity, and the quality of life that this biodiversity has is increasing every time that we make an intervention. And this is one of the really main core goals of all the maintenance works and all the interventions we do in the farm, is to improve ecological processes and to increase the conditions for consolidated life. Plantations which mobilize, transform, and recycle their nutrients as well as water, and are therefore have a very low necessity of external inputs. So external inputs refers to irrigation or artificial irrigation and fertilization, because the plantations are able to work with these cycles. Healthy plants which are not subject to pests and diseases. This results out of the fact that we really work to give the right conditions to every single plant, so that it has the right amount of shade, the right amount of light in certain seasons, that it has the right amount of pruning, that the crown shape of it is well balanced, and that it all fits in within this dynamic. And then the pests and diseases, that's another thing that's interesting, because for the practitioners of this form of agriculture, pests and diseases actually do not exist. Pests and diseases make part of the same department that we ourselves as farmers should make part of, which is the agents. The pests and diseases are the agents of the department for optimization of life processes. I'll repeat again. So the pests and diseases, or what we think of, normal farmers think of as pests and diseases, are the agents of the department of optimization of life processes. So they are not there to mistreat our plants, but they are there to put the ecosystem back into balance. When you have a pest and disease in your crop, you can be sure that there is something that you did that you did not manage to fit that plant into the flow of life, into the dynamic of that place. There's something wrong within the context in which you planted that crop. If your apple trees gets a lot of aphids, there's something wrong with the pruning you did, if you fertilized it, if there's something wrong, you know. And so for us, Ernst always says that to him, the ants or the different bugs, the fungi that attack his crops, they give him lessons and indications for how he should be acting, and that the biggest pest that exists within his forest is he himself. And then so plantations which are based around species well adapted to the conditions of the site, which are able to grow vigorously without external inputs and react well to pruning or radical pruning, which these plants are the ones that really push our plantations forward and that give the vigor to all the crops. And then maintenance interventions, which have the core goal to optimize the natural processes of the site, so maintaining the ecosystem in balance, maintaining all the different crops at their, in their right context, and creating the light and shade dynamics, which I'll get back to later. So these are 6 like more practical points, but then I think the one that really marks this whole thing is the philosophical elements that contribute to this form of agriculture. And I think one of the, is really, what standpoint does the farmer take when he is intervening with his crops, and how does he see himself relating to them? And the one that Ernst says a lot is that he is not the intelligent one, but he makes part of an intelligent system. And that we should not see ourselves as the intelligent ones, but that we should actually get down of our little pedestal that we have put ourselves upon because of thinking that we are the intelligent ones, which we are not. So like, let's say a normal farmer, he will plant potatoes and the potatoes get sick, and the farmer gets mad because he thinks he did everything right, and he blames the fungus and he puts a chemical on it to kill the fungus. That's the action that somebody takes that thinks that he's the one that knows how the potato should be planted. But if you would understand or have the viewpoint that you're part of an intelligent system, you would try to understand why that fungus came and what you could improve in your cultivation method for it not to come back. And it's quite easy with potatoes actually, but that's a whole other subject. Another philosophical element is that when we look at these plantations, we look at them as macroorganisms. So all these different plants you see planted together here form together a macroorganism. And these plantations, these macroorganisms on a larger scale, are the cells within the organs that make our planet breathe and live. You see the dynamics of the season, you see how the planet is breathing. And just as these plantations are a cell within a bigger macroorganism, our planet is a cell within a bigger macroorganism. And the laws that this macroorganism follows, we cannot change. And that's something that we are obliged to follow. We cannot work against that, because otherwise we start, the second we start working against the functioning of this macroorganism of which we are a part, we start diminishing the quality of conditions that we have ourselves for being here. So, so this macroorganism follows a set of laws, and to illustrate this first one, there's this summary. I don't remember his first name. He wrote a book called Dirt, talking about, it's called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations. It's a really interesting book. He really describes how many civilizations throughout the past have really gone down the same track. He starts with the Mesopotamians, and he goes to the Egyptians, then he goes to the Greek, then to the Romans, and then so on and so forth. Here in Portugal, in Spain, in Europe, and nowadays in the Americas, how every single civilization, and he documents this and shows it, every single one of these great civilizations collapsed due to the same reason, which was resource depletion. Working against the logic of the macroorganism of which we are part. And so so these three ideas that exist is that there's competition. The other one that a lot of people nowadays talk about is sustainability. And then there's the other one that is, let's say, unconditional love and cooperation. The competition, the second that we start competing with each other for things, even if there's enough, just the idea of competition will lead us into a mindset of scarcity. If we are already competing and we enter into scarcity or start having feelings of scarcity while we're already in this conflict with each other, this conflict will lead us eventually to war. And this war will have its fatalities, and the war will, maybe one war will have an end, but one war will lead to another, and each one of them will lead to death. And that will be the end of the organism that is subjected to this logic. And if you would think about life on this planet has existed for 3 or 4 billion years and has gone from just occupying and colonizing these little rocks to these exuberant rainforests full of species, full of diversity, full of opportunities, full of different manners of expressing itself. If all of these different plants, if all these different animals were just fighting with each other and living to eradicate each other, that wouldn't have ever been able to happen. And if you follow the path of 100% sustainable, it would indicate that there's no progress, there's no new arisal of new forms of expression, of new forms of manifestation, and the macroorganism starts to stagnate. It's like a kid at 5 years old that stops growing. It stagnates, and the kid enters into crisis. The macroorganism enters into crisis. Because really its goal is to find new ways to express itself, to condensate energy, to accumulate resources, to complexify all these different things. And so with the unconditional love and cooperation path, we immediately set the stage for abundance. And with this abundance, we can go to peace, because we have enough for ourselves, the neighbors have enough for themselves, everybody is living on this mindset of unconditional love and cooperation, creates peace, and this peace then leads to life, and life based on these pillars can continue. And
I just said a heart.
Yeah.
And so if you look at life and what it's done through the past billions of years that it's existed on this planet, it is quite clear that it has taken this path. Otherwise it wouldn't have been able to leave us with this abundance, with this diversity, with this huge richness that we have inherited. And well, the other law, maybe let's take a moment to digest. Oh, start again. The other law is like, it indicates that everything happens in these kind of rhythmical patterns. So you see the pendulum swinging back and forth. Nothing is ever at an end. Nothing is ever steady. Everything is bound to cycles that once they seem they reach their peak, it starts again. And it starts with a disturbance. You saw the star exploding, you saw the tree falling down. It's a disturbance in the system that then leads to a reorganization of the resources. So imagine that there is a star exploding, there's all these different rocks and minerals and all these different resources spread out throughout space. The bigger rocks, through gravity, will start adhering to, will start getting smaller rocks to them, and it starts from new. And the same thing in the forest. When a tree falls down, the organic material it leaves behind starts being processed and transformed by all these different microorganisms. And so you have the disturbance, which leads to the reorganization, which leads to a transformation in the whole system, so an arisal of new opportunities, which leads to the regeneration, which is what you see here. There's a beam growing here with a cacao tree underneath. If I cannot start the video again. And then once this system that has now regenerated starts to mature, it starts to set fruits, which contain the seeds to contribute to the seed bank of the place. So the forest, the ecosystem starts creating a kind of stock of seeds to prepare itself for the next disturbance. For in case if there's another disturbance, all the seeds are already there. And if it goes on enough time, it will reach this transitional phase where the system is preparing itself for the next disturbance. And so you always have this cycle happening. And so it's in tropic farming, we divide all of our different plants into these different life cycles that it starts with the early crops such as corn and beans. Then it goes to the longer-lived crops such as cassava and papaya and inhame and ginger. And then it goes to the first short-lived trees that then go to the trees of the secondary forest of medium life cycle, that then give stage to the secondary forest of long life cycle, that then gives stage to the primary forest. And once the primary forest has reached a certain stage of maturity, it enters into this transitional phase. And you see here that the life cycle indicated for all these different groups vary a lot, because it depends a lot on the presence of all the species and the maintenance that is being done. Like for example, here it's indicated that 3 until 80 years until this life cycle passes on to the next one. So the secondary forest of medium life cycle could already be established within 3 years or 5 years, but it could also take 80 years to establish itself. And that really depends on if all the species are there. So if there are certain species of the secondary forest of short life cycle missing in the place might not be able to make the right changes in the resource of the place to be able to move on to the next one. And these plants, they might not have, because so everything is planted together at the same moment in the beginning. When I plant the corn, I already plant my oak trees as well, that have the really long life cycle, and the olive trees. But, and also everything that's in between. So if there is a gap somewhere in the middle, it might delay the whole process. And yeah, then you have these plants that I'm indicating here, which belong to disturbance systems, which are the ones that we typically work with for human consumption. So apples, pears, cherries, nuts, citrus, figs, grapes, and then the tropical crops like cacao, cupuaçu, acai, and all of this belongs to this disturbance system. Most of them are plants or trees from the secondary forest of medium life cycle. And in order for them to remain productive, the system needs to be subjected to periodic disturbances. This could be in nature done by the wind or by flooding, but it could also be done by, and is done in a lot of places, by ants, by other bugs, by birds, by monkeys, by elephants. All these different animals, all these different vectors can cause large disturbances within the ecosystem that then lead to these regenerative processes that stimulate fructification. And yeah, there's here like a small example of how this could be. Like for example, here this was some of my first vegetable beds that I planted in Brazil. So that's one other thing that's interesting to mention, because when you want to learn something like this, it's really important that you take it step by step. So when I started learning this 4 years ago, I would make every 2 days this much plantation. Every 2 days I would make this much, and then reflect, what did I do? What did I do wrong? What could I improve? And then I started taking big, once I finished like the first 20 days, I then had enough lessons and could already have some insights, and then I thought, okay, how could I improve now? And then I started making bigger fields, and then from there bigger fields, and well, I'm still looking to learn more so that I can make bigger fields. And yeah, but so yeah, this was one of the first things I planted as beans, corn, pumpkins, cassava, ginger, inhame, papaya, and then all the different trees: cacao, cupuaçu, jaca, patasta, acai, Brazil nut, and many, many, many more. Jatuba, jaracatia, arariba, and I don't know to name more right now. But anyways, you see that I planted too much corn and too much beans and too much pumpkins, because always like the same logic. With these plants, we had a lot of seeds, so I was like, okay, I'm going to put 5 corn plants here, 5 corn plants here, 5 corn plants here, 3 beans here, 3 beans here, 3 beans there, and then I always select the most beautiful ones. So My goal was to have every 1 meter, 3 corn plants together, in the middle a pumpkin, and then along the borders the beans. And so I had planted every half a meter the corn, so I had to take away every second one. Afterwards it looked like this, after taking the corn, the beans, and the excess pumpkins away. And there's also something we do with the trees, because as I mentioned before, plants do not compete with each other. If you put all here, I would plant every 10 centimeters a cacao tree by seed. They don't compete with each other. They go through a process that is called, or that we call, co-definition. They amongst each other decide and define who is the most adapted to the conditions of that spot. Who is the one that is able to thrive? Who is the one that is able to invest, that the place can invest itself in for the future? And all the other ones, while they are there, before they decide to take themselves away, they are contributing to the healthy establishment of that one that will stay for the future. And that's why when I said earlier that I would plant 10 or 20 trees per square meter, somebody got surprised. But it's because of this. So you really go through this natural process that would happen also in a natural forest. If you go to forest in, for example, Germany, I give the example of Germany instead of here Portugal, because here the forests are really, really denaturalized. In Germany we still have a bit healthier forests. If a big tree falls down, you really see millions of trees coming up. Every centimeter there will be a little tree. And then the trees amongst themselves will start deciding which one is the most adapted. The deer does not eat trees based on the fact of taking or filling its stomach, but it eats the trees to also help the trees decide which one is going to stay. So it also stays there with the idea of optimizing the ecosystem. And for example, in my farm close to here, my neighbors have a lot of, or in the region, a lot of people making tree plantations and vegetable plantations have a lot of problems with wild boars. In the rainy seasons, if you go to my plantation, you can see, I'm just saying the rainy season because it's the time of the year when the wild boar is more active, and also when you can see his footsteps in the floor. And you will notice that he takes walks through my plantation. He doesn't disturb anything. He just passes through. And the places where, like when he does something, things usually afterward, like one time I remember I made a plantation, and 2 days after I planted everything, so the soil was nice and loose and everything was nice and prepared, the wild boar went with his nose like immediately along the center of the road, where I put all the acorns, where I put all the ash trees, where I put all the seeds of the different trees, the vegetables and everything. I got quite upset and thought that he was there to destroy something. In the end, that's the most beautiful row of trees that I had from that year. He didn't take away any acorns, like you would think. And if you think about it, it makes all the sense in the world, because he on his nose, he walks around all the different areas of Montado. From his intestine and between his nose, he has all the different microbiology of the place, because he enters in all the different bushes and all the different soils, he digs through everything. And then he goes and he inoculates my plantation for me. I don't need to do it.
Working for free.
Yeah. And so, you know, like, and birds, they start bringing you a lot of seeds when you start working like this. When you start creating the conditions for these animals to work, they start working. In my farm, I started seeing a huge increase in the amount of birds. Because I put these little wires to tutor my blackberries along all the tree rows. And the birds, they love it. They go between the young trees and they go on the wires and they go on the trees and they jump down. Freddy, he knows the place a bit. He can maybe serve as an eyewitness. Juan Pablo also. Freddy has passed a bit more time there. But anyways, this is how the place looked 1 week later after I did this pruning. You see, all of a sudden the corn doesn't have nutrient deficiencies anymore like it did before, and everything grew crazily. And that's a concept that we work a lot with in syntropic farming, which is the it's like a reset in the growth cycle of the plants to stimulate them to grow more vigorously, to mobilize more nutrients, to cycle more water. And so from this experience, Ernst then recommended me to plant grasses together with my young trees and corn. And so when I prune the grasses, this is immediately after I prune it, you will be able to see that it didn't rain in the meantime because the grasses, they just dried, it didn't decompose. You'll see in the next picture. And now look at the next picture from 1 week later. Things grew incredibly. Also the cassava, also all the things down here below, the grass is already coming back. And all the trees that I'd put by seed started making new leaves again. So everything starts growing again. Because the grasses, when they have this apical pruning, they enter into a state of excited growth. They start growing with the faster cell division. To support the faster cell division, or let's start like this. They start accelerating their photosynthetic activity. They start making more photosynthesis. They start accelerating the velocity of cell division. And to support these two metabolic processes of theirs, the accelerated growth and the accelerated rate of photosynthesis, they need more water and they need more minerals or more nutrients. So they start with all these sugars that they're now fixing from the sunlight, feeding soil microbiology that can mobilize these minerals and the water. And this is an effect that the second that the grasses are pruned, it starts making a lot more roots, start feeding all this soil microbiology that starts mobilizing all these minerals, all this water. The whole plantation, as a result of the grasses being pruned, enters into a state of excited growth, and all the different plants that are connected to the same root network benefit from this activity of the microbiology in the soil. So when I talked earlier about that our main goal is to optimize ecosystem processes and optimize the functioning of the ecosystem, this is what I mean. To do these disturbances and do these maintenance tasks that always bring photosynthesis to an optimum level. And this has to do here with this graphic. You can see here is growth vigor, here is time. The moment the seed germinates, he moves on to the establishment phase. And then once he's made his first 4 or 5 sets of true leaves, he enters into a stage of exponential growth. During the stage of exponential growth, he begins to flower. At the moment he ends flowering, he starts decreasing his vigor, investing into the ripening of the seeds. His seeds ripen. He starts entering, or growth vigor still starts decaying, or starts to decay, and he starts to ripen his plant tissues and enters into senescence. Senescence is the process of the plant dying. And so the idea that Ernst had was that the moment that the plants start entering into senescence, or before they actually enter into senescence, to prune them or remove them from the system. And so this then causes following to happen, that if the plant accepts these apical prunings and then regrows, it grows again, but with much more vigor, because it already has more resources available, already has a strong root system. And if it was, like, if let's say this was a corn, that now we harvested the corn, and this is now the cassava that grows after it. The cassava now is actually able to grow, whereas if we would have left the corn, the cassava and the whole system would have entered or received part of this information of senescence. Because the plant, when it enters into senescence, does the opposite of what I explained earlier. It doesn't feed or microbiology that mobilizes minerals and mobilizes water, but it does the opposite. It blocks the nutrient cycle, it blocks the water cycle, because it wants to protect its seeds. So it actually reduces the humidity in the place, it reduces the capacity of other plants to grow. And if we intervene, the whole thing goes forward. And in the forest, this then looks a bit like this. This is an unpruned plantation before pruning. And then Ernst goes in with a chainsaw, and 10 minutes later it looks like this. And he took about 70%. This was part of a scientific documentation that I was doing. Every square meter here on the floor, I had measured with ropes and sticks. So there was a whole grid on the floor, and then I had a millimeter paper with the same grid drawn on it, and I was measuring the canopy of all the trees and the foliar coverage of all the different trees, and then calculating all the millimeter boxes that each tree was occupying to understand the difference before and after the pruning. And in this case, it reduced by 70% the canopy of the forest. So, yeah. So this was before. And then he goes in and he prunes, like here this below is the cacao trees. In this intervention he didn't do any pruning of them. He only really did the canopy trees.
What he prunes, he leaves down to...
It's all cut up in pieces and organized.
Oh, it's mulch?
Yeah, exactly. And that's really important.
By hand or by machine?
By hand, in this case.
That's a lot of labor, right?
You get fast at it, and well, you don't have to chip it in these tiny little pieces, you know, but you just chip it small enough. You take the branches and then you start organizing it, you know. Like the thinner branches you cut up with the machete and all the leaves fall on the floor. Everything that's thicker than this, you start organizing perpendicular to the slope of the hill, so that when it rains, the water gets trapped under the logs of the wood. And yeah, it's a good exercise.
So they use the logs to like make swales?
Not really. It's more like organizing them perpendicular to the slope.
Perpendicular to the slope, or?
Yeah.
Like you had before in your vegetable.
Exactly.
So
So,
to the slope to stop the water.
so the water stays longer underneath the log.
Okay.
Yeah, like swells.
Like
Like
swells.
swell of that.
Yeah, swales is like a trap for water.
This is just to cover the soil, so the decomposition
Like
happens all the sides.
Yeah. No, like you see, like with this, you won't ever have like with the swale, you'll always get it full. If it rains a lot, the swale will fill up with water, right? This doesn't.
Okay, it's just keeping humidity.
It helps the wood decompose faster. Yeah. Anyways, so this is another example. Here's before pruning. Here's after pruning. Like when we talk about pruning, it's really apical pruning. So climbing up the trees and then taking off the root and maintaining the same structure of the tree. So if the tree has this structure before, he has this structure after, but it's just reduced. So we always start pruning from the top. We decide at which height we want to take the tree back to, and that has a lot to do with all the other trees that are surrounded by it. So we have this all these different species classified into 11 stratus: emergent, tall to emergent, going to emergent, tall to emergent, canopy, medium to canopy, medium canopy, medium. I will show this later. But anyway, so each tree is managed and pruned so it stays in the correct context with its neighbors, and which is really, really important. And then maintaining its original crown shape. 1 month later, even in winter, when there's actually no new growth in cacao trees usually, they will make a really strong new growth, making a lot of new leaves. And they get this really, really healthy and vibrant aspect. This picture shows it even better, like the amount of new leaves that the trees make after the pruning. And the cacao trees do it a bit faster than the other trees, so they actually they anticipate the other ones before the canopy closes. And it's really, really important to maintain a balance in this. Like I remember that one time I was pruning a cacao plantation, and I pruned the canopy trees too much. I reduced the canopy too much, and the cacao trees burned, and for 2 years Ernst was having problems there. And so it really takes a lot of really knowledge and feeling and sensitivity for the trees, and calculating. It's really context specific. Every tree is different, and you always have to see how they're standing to each other. And then after they make their new leaves, they start flowering and they start setting a lot of fruits, which is then what we harvest. And the byproduct of this maintenance service is the organic material that goes down to the floor, which is never the primary objective of the maintenance and the pruning. Like a lot of times when people that get really animated about this form of agroforestry, they think that the main and most important thing is to cover and protect the soil, and then they sacrifice a lot of their trees or do prunings on their trees just to get organic material down. But that's not the objective. The objective is to optimize the metabolism of the tree and the context in which it's standing with all its neighbors, and not to bring down the organic material. The organic material is a byproduct of this optimization maintenance. This we can skip. This was another plantation that I had made there in a forest clearing that I did. This was a really big adventure. You can see here all the logs of the trees that I'd cut down and then organized and then planted here a new forest. Here in these rows we planted corn and other vegetables together with all the trees. That's where the majority of all the wood went. And then here in the middle we planted cassava. Gave a really big cassava production and also quite a bit of corn. And I still expanded this field a lot in this direction afterwards. But yeah, this was during my internship there. And you can see like this is then what the young plantation looks like. And this is then going back to the forest. So there's already all the different trees of all the life cycles in there that bring this back to the forest. You see here the young cacao trees, for example. A really important subject is the stratification of the forests. You see nowadays the intensive or the monoculture forestry plantations. They usually focus on these trees that belong to the emergent stratus because they make really straight stems and are really easy for the forestry department people to work with. And they plant them without anything below. Closed canopy of emergent trees, nothing below. This leads to the reality that, let's say up here in the air temperature on that day is 32 degrees Celsius. It actually gets hotter down here in the floor because of air currents that start developing here along the floor. The soil is unprotected. There's no vegetation down here in all of this. Soil starts heating up. You also see that there is no organic matter layer on the soil because the organic material usually oxidizes in a harsher climate like here in Portugal or in the tropics. And in the Portuguese scenario of the eucalyptus, they even plow underneath the eucalyptus trees to maintain everything nice and clean so that there's no fires. And what happens is that you get these air drafts as a result of the thermodynamics you maybe have seen it in these open fields. If there's an open field here in Portugal in early summer, there's always these little wind currents that take away the straw and take away some soil. On the days that the air is getting really hot and the soil starts heating up. And so up here it's hot, down here it's hotter, and here where the trees have their leaves is actually coolest. And so the water from the soil looking for a cool place, like the water always tries to go to a place where it has about 4 degrees Celsius, because that's where it's most specifically dense. It starts evaporating, going up here, and then it's lifted away by the wind. And people say that the eucalyptus tree dries out places due to evapotranspiration, but it's not evapotranspiration. It's the thermodynamics that occur as a result of the design of their implemented forest. So that's why these places then dry out and start losing soil fertility. What we do in syntropic farming, this is the model that Ernst always refers to and that he works to maintain within his farm. He has a really open canopy of these emergent trees, and he works that they only cover 15 to 25% of the total area. If we go back to the previous image, about 90% of the total area was covered with leaves, because there's some gaps between the trees. And so the area is not even 100% covered, and here the emerging trees cover 15 to 25%. Then you have the canopy layer, which covers 30 to 40% of the area. Then you have the medium stratus, which covers 40 to 60% of the area. And you already see the pattern. When you go down to the low stratus, it's 60 to 80% of the area. That every time you go down one stratus, the density of the vegetation gets higher. That means that down here you have the highest amount of photosynthesis. If we would really want to study stratification, there's actually the emergent stratus, then there's the tall to emergent stratus with tendency to emergent, and then just the tall to emergent stratus. Then there's the canopy stratus or tall stratus. Then there's the medium to canopy stratus with tendency to canopy. And then there's the medium to canopy stratus without tendency to either one, it just stays here in between. And then you have the medium to low stratus, and then you have also the herbaceous layer. And then the 11th stratus is the regeneration layer. So that's all the young trees that grow from the seeds that are being deposited from the older trees that are there already preparing. So like imagine you have oak trees here, and on the foot of the oak trees you usually, if there's not too many animals, see smaller oak trees about this big or this big, that they don't grow much every year. They grow very little, but they go down. And the second the big one falls away, they already have a really, really deep root system, and then they will grow really fast. And so there's also this regeneration layer to be accounted for.
Wouldn't you have to do a lot of pruning to keep it like that? To just maintain it? Because if you do it like that, within a year or leave it, within a year it'd be...
Yeah, once a year, twice a year, twice a year even. Like once a year is really radical pruning, where you really take away 70, 80 or even 90% of the leaf area of different trees. And
Sorry, but this is also in a tropical context, right? This
Yeah.
kind of change between different
Yeah.
narrow system, temperate zones.
exactly. But here in our context, a lot of trees already lose their leaves in winter, so it already allows a lot for that dynamic to occur. Like in our context here, in the tropical context, it's really like closed evergreen forests. And so in winter, when he experiences winter, the rainy season there, he really opens up the whole thing. He takes away 80% of the canopy, 70% of the medium stratus, even the cacao. He takes away 60 or 70% of all the leaves. He really like strips the whole thing down, and then it grows again. And in summer, he does a cleanup prune, just really light pruning to direct the trees in a good direction again. Here, as you have a different scenario, I would always opt to have more open forests that mimic a bit more like a savanna, so you could have cereal or vegetable production in the long term underneath the forest canopy, or integrate livestock. And well, yeah, but it's a lot of maintenance work. Every year, 2 times he does this pruning. And but this all leads to the fact that up here, if the air temperature is 32 degrees, it's about 8 to 10 degrees lower down here in the bottom of the plantation, so significantly cooler. When the wind current comes, it hits here the taller trees, and as there is an open canopy, it hits the tree, it's directed back, it hits the tree, it's directed back, and it creates this vortex, this funnel that's drawing in air from the atmosphere. And as the wind is much hotter than the air temperature down here in the plantation, when it cools off, it has to condensate all the humidity that's carrying with it. And there in Ernst Farm, this accounts for a lot of the water that the plants are getting, because they, the wind there is coming from the ocean, and it's a humid tropical climate. So in all times of the year, that wind is really humid. And then when it gets down here to the bottom of the plantation, it cools off really strongly, and it deposits all the humidity that it was carrying into the plantation. And this is how you really also recharge aquifers, because when the water comes down, it doesn't enter the ground like if it was rainwater. It doesn't enter the ground via gravity. but by temperature differences. It's really being sucked in. And what's maybe much more important to this specific presentation is the whole talk about the Portuguese context and the work that I've been doing here for the past 1.5 years. After my apprenticeship there in Brazil, I got a small piece of land 1.5 hours away from here in the Alentejo, where I started working. And my goal was principally to adapt as closely as possible, or as closely as I could, the principles of agriculture that I learned with Ernst Götsch to the context of my farm. And here you can see an image of how the farm was when I arrived. And following this, I will show you a video where I'm walking from here, let's say where this tree is. It's not quite true, it's like 2 meters to the side of this tree. And I'm walking down here. And this video was taken about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So this is what it looks like now. And before all these trees actually started growing, I harvested a lot of vegetables, a lot of cabbages, radishes, garlic, onions, potatoes. List goes on and on and on. 99% of what I eat comes from here. And after I harvest the vegetables, the trees grow. And here in this park, you already have some trees that are reaching 4 or 5 meters tall. Other ones are still smaller. I'm making experiments there. This field does have irrigation, but the amount of water I give to it is very, very limited. The long-term goal is to be able to work without irrigation in all fields. About 10% of what the organic farmers in the region give. And that was in the first year, the 10%. And now this year, so last year I was irrigating 1 hour every 2 days. And the drippers that I have on my irrigation system give a lot less water than what other farmers use. And this year on this field, so this was in the middle of July, or no, it was beginning of August when I took this video. Until the end of July, I would only irrigate this field once every 2 weeks for 1 hour. Which, like, if you tell a farmer in the region that has fruit trees that you do that, they all irrigate every 2 days for 4 to 5 hours with really strong drippers. I have drippers with half the potency. I irrigate like pretty much nothing. And then I have citrus trees in there, which is like for the conventional farmers one of the most water demanding crops. And they are doing great. Full of new leaves, full of young fruits in the second year with very limited access to water. And so here you see again a picture of how the field was before. This is here the entrance of my farm. And this is then half a year later. So half a year after implementation, you see here a lot of corn. I then planted my tomatoes, my paprikas, and pumpkins and everything. This was in June, at the end of June 2020. And now this is in the beginning of July 2021, so 1 year later, maybe a year and a week later. So things really grew. You see here again, a lot in this field, most of it was by seed and also cuttings. Fruit trees like the citrus, I planted as plants, and also the olive trees. There was then some plants that I haven't quite figured out yet how to grow them by seed, because here a lot of plants have these really tiny seeds that need to be fermented, that need to be cold stratified or heat stratified, or all these different processes, and that ripen at different times of the year. And so I'm still making a lot of experiments to try to understand how all these different seeds grow from when they plant directly. But yeah, then you see here June 2020, July 2021, and the picture is taken in the same spot. You see here again, you have here the oak tree as a reference, and then 1 year later. And this is now from January, the new fields that we started implementing. This is a field that has never been irrigated. even up until now, is a field to be done from the beginning until the end without irrigation. Has a bit different species in it. And then this field here was the continuation of the field that I did last year. So here you have the field that I did last year, and this is now connecting the two of them. You see here again the aerial footage of the farm. And the field without irrigation that was planted in November 2020. The field that's now been planted January to February 2021, and the field of January, February 2020. And this is from the same day as the one before. It just gives like a little overview of the farm. It's about 1 hectare that I've planted by now. And you see now, this is like 2 or 3 weeks later. This field without irrigation, interestingly, was actually the most green one that I had in spring, and in early summer was the most green. By now it's really dry, but there's all the trees are pretty much alive. About 85% of them are alive, of the ones we planted, which in more conventional reforestation programs in the region, I saw success rates of only 2 or 3% of the trees that they planted. And so here we already have much higher, with 85%, much more satisfying results. You can see that by then we had finished this plantation here. All of this here was all dug by hand.
Is that just care and preparation?
Huh?
Is that just care and preparation? You're getting great.
Yeah, and planting things together, and then when I plant, for example, the young trees, I plant cabbages and fava beans and all these other crops together with them, and I do really, exactly, and then I do maintenance of those plants. So I don't just plant them and let them dry and die, but before they even enter into a stage of senescence, I'm already there checking that everything is good. There's never a single weed. Is always, Freddie might be able to give a witness account. So I really like to have my plantations like super organized. And this is now in April. In spring, the most beautiful time of the year, whenever the trees start getting green again and the pasture is all green. I'll let this play for a moment. And so this is now the new field where I'm now doing my vegetable garden. In the first year I do my vegetable garden. In the second year I already don't. Then the trees already start becoming dominant. And this, as I said, in spring and early summer, this was the most green field. You see it's all really... And this field, the place where I made the field without irrigation, was the most dry and degraded part of my whole farm. Actually has two realities. Down here in this bottom part is the place on my farm where it's most waterlogged in winter and most dry in summer, and then it has a hill on top. There's no topsoil. It's only, it's not rocks, but it's like unweathered rocks. It's like a soil that's like, it almost looks like sand, but it's just granite. It's a really interesting substrate. Most people say it's really unfertile. And this is the most recent video, and also the last slide that I'll be showing now. This is from 3 weeks ago.
How long did you observe the farm before you started planting trees?
Not so long actually, but the region, I had done an internship on the same farm and taken a lot of hours walking around the area and getting to know the place and gathering ideas before starting on my farm. So I think like maybe 1 or 2 months before I actually started really planting, I was gathering like knowledge about the farm place. But I think by now, after having spent, like I haven't left the place since unless for like things like this, which is also like really few times, since February 2020. So I'm there every day, and by now I obviously have a completely different idea of what the place is.
How have you prepared the soil?
It depends on the places. Like in some places it was by hand, digging holes like this deep, loosening the soil this deep. And I think this year we made over 1,300 of these preparations for the soil. Then in other parts it's with a machine that was developed by the man that I did my apprenticeship with, that loosens the soil deeply without turning it, and but only on a 80 centimeter wide space, and then it has a rotative hole above that takes away all the clumps and unevenness of the soils, and then leaves like a perfect tree planting bed that is 80 centimeters wide and has a soil that's loosened 50 centimeters deep, with one passage of the machine. No, it needs a 70 horsepower tractor, because it goes really deep and really needs a lot of power. Yeah.
Have your neighbors noticed this, and has it changed anything about what they do?
Well, the place where I am is a state that was the first place in all of Portugal to certify as organic agriculture, and they were also the first place to make a permaculture workshop here in Portugal, and so they were always really incentivizing and looking for new opportunities and different things to do. And for that also, that's why I'm also there. That's why I'm able to rent this piece of land from them, so I make my experiments. And the idea of my farm is much more, it's an experimental farm where I am trying to understand the climate, the conditions of the place, and how to work, like what are the really necessary plants to work on that place to make plantations in larger scale. And that will be in cooperation with the estate where I have my land rented. And there's other places in the region that are also really interested in having me go work there, but then really have the huge limitation of what I can do. Because by now there's like opportunities where if I wanted I could plant 1,000 hectares this winter, but I cannot because I only have 2 hands. And like I can have some people working with me and learning with me, and the goal is to have that more and more, like having people who are really there that do long-term traineeships with me that stay for a year or even 2 years, that really learn to then, because the goal of this whole project is to bring scale to this form of agriculture here in Portugal. And one of the key factors to bring scale to it is not availability to land, but it's availability to train people. People that know what they're doing, that are really focused, that are disciplined, that really want to make this work. Maybe just because Juan Pablo and me, we had this kind of Q&A thing planned, where he has like 3 or 4 questions prepared.
Yeah, I just want to share a deep gratitude for your talk, Marc, because you're a beautiful storyteller and the spirituality really shines through when you're sharing, and the way that you think is very beautiful and very evolved, and from the micro to the macro. So I just want to say thank you, because you're going to bring a lot of value to the planet, and you teaching younger children is going to really, I'd love to help you scale that. So yeah, I just want to say thank you.
So, I mean, we have a few questions, but these may answer already what you have in mind. These are just a bit structured so that we can help Marc explain some of these as critical aspects, but we will have enough time to answer even more. So, just as a way of summarizing a little bit what we talked about, which elements of syntropic farming do you think are directly applicable to the Portuguese context, and which ones do you think are not necessary?
I think like the one that is super, and both of them were here traditionally, is the stratification and the pruning. If you look here at the oak trees, All of them were pruned until 40, 50 years ago. Every last oak tree in the Alentejo was pruned every 9 to 10 years. That's why they have this really open canopy. You have this one oak tree just there that grows really like this. You must have noticed it, right, Freddie? And you have all the other ones that are really like this, with really open branches. No branches going up in the middle, but just this really open canopy. They would do this taking off the top and then getting the tree to make these side branches, these legs, as they call it. And then also, and every 9 to 10 years, they would take away all the branches from the middle and cut in the sides to re-incentivize the growth of those trees. The year after pruning, they would put cereals or other crops underneath those trees, and then they would have, for the remaining years, until the pruning, pasture underneath it again. And so it was a 9 to 10 year cycle where they would let the trees rest, where they then prune it. The year after the pruning, they would put the crops, and they also used to have these montados much more stratified. If you ask the people in the region, until 40 or 50 years ago, the rains were much more predictable, the temperatures and the weather was much more predictable, there was a lot more water. All these creeks, all these rivers used to flow all year round until 40 or 50 years ago here in this region. And 40 or 50 years ago, this all changed. It was also the time of the Green Revolution and the time when they were making during the dictatorship, Salazar had the idea to turn the Alentejo into the biggest production of wheat in all of Europe. And so he really intensified the wheat production here in the Alentejo. A lot of tilling, a lot of fertilization, a lot of trees went away. And the trees that especially went away were the ones that were not oaks, because the oaks had a very high value to the people in terms of the acorns for food, for the people themselves, and also for the pigs. And then the cork oak because of the cork. So both had really high economic values. But the other trees, the strawberry tree, the wild pistachio trees, the ones that grew below the oak trees, started being seen as weeds, and all of them were taken away. Whereas if I speak to the people that are around 80 years old in my village where I live, they say that in the past, people were not allowed to prune oak trees until they were well trained, and the trees that they would train on were the strawberry trees, and they were big. Nowadays there's none of that size anymore. And so it shows that in the past the montados were much more stratified, and they were much more, the maintenance was done much more to favor photosynthetic processes. Whereas nowadays it's a really extensively managed system.
So I'm just going to do one more. I think this question was asked in the previous session. So with regards to inputs such as manure, water, or an integration with livestock, for example, if you could restart your experiment from the start, what do you think you would change?
So for one, I said it in the earlier presentation, but it's not because I'm not happy with my land. I said that I would have chosen an area that had no trees on it at all, because I could mechanize much easier. It would be much more efficient for me to make plantations. I could organize much neater, and I could make a much more professional and actual viable work. Where the reality that I'm in is that if you look at my land from above, you see, like, I will let this play, because then you will see, you see that here the plantations I've made so far are the places with the least amount of trees. My land goes up until here, and then cuts across here, and it has like this corner back here. And all of these loads of trees, it really makes it difficult for me to mechanize a plantation underneath it and to make really a nice organization. Whereas if I would have chosen an area up here, which I also could have, I would just make straight rows, and it would have been nice and neat. Anyways, now I'm there, which I'm also happy for, because I have a lot of beautiful trees already. And I think also what I'm seeing now is in the plantation. In the plantations I will do now from now forward is that I will work with just a basic amount of external inputs to help catalyze the processes. So for plants, like the thing is, like for example, the field without irrigation I made last year, we didn't put any compost, any manure, any fertilization. And during winter, I had a really beautiful production of radishes, I had a really beautiful production of garlic. But I could not establish any sunflowers to stay green in summer. I could not establish any beans. I could not establish any sorghum because of lack of fertility. And my goal for this year now is to give initial boost in fertility with rock dusts and chicken manure, and then invest into plants that establish during winter and spring, but are able to stay green in summer. So that I actually have a protection for my trees. Because in the field without irrigation that we did last year, I now just have all the trees exposed to the sun. I have nothing there to protect them. And
you said that you also were interested in doing livestock integration as you scale up your projects. Do you think that livestock could solve some of those problems, or like
for the long term?
So not at the initial stages, you would not use livestock, but just eventually?
Exactly, like if I made a plantation with the goal to integrate livestock in it, I would make the rows much more spacious. It would be plantations of larger areas with at least 6 or 8 meters between the tree rows, maybe 4 or 5. Maybe I could make like rows with trees that for the animals to graze on, like shrubs for the animals to graze on, but really the rows of the main trees like 8 meters apart. And then it would need 1 or 2 years, maybe even 3, for the trees to establish before you can put the livestock in there. Because otherwise they start eating the trees.
Thank you so much. Joshua, please. If you want.
Yeah, you mentioned quite a few times this relationship between the farmer and the trees and the plants. I was curious, if you could just describe that relationship a bit more, and describe also how you kind of cultivate this sense of empathy, as you mentioned, or this sense of intuition for how to know what to do.
It's not a really easy question to answer, but maybe it is. I remember a lot of times being with Ernst in courses or something like this, or when Ernst was receiving visitors, and they would ask him, how do you know how to prune the cacao tree? Or can you explain me how to prune the cacao tree? And he would get really mad, and he's like, why do you ask me? Why don't you ask the tree? So it's really like when he talks, like when you ask him, how do I prune a tree? He's like, you have to enter into dialogue with the tree. You have to start asking the tree, and you have to start understanding what it tells you and getting these hints. And it's the same when you enter into a piece of land. You ask, and Ernst, he always says this in his presentations. It took me about 3.5 years of listening to his presentations to realize that he actually does it. The first thing he does when he gets to a place is he stands there and he asks, what can I do in order to be useful? What can I do in order to be useful? And he really asks that. And when he arrives somewhere, he's really quiet and he doesn't say anything. But you see there's something really profound happening. And then he gets an answer. And that's really this relationship. I called it once state of authentic being. It's like when you switch off this state where you think you're in control, or this state of rational thinking, you know, and you're just letting your thoughts be. You're just clean, you know. And it usually happens when you're by yourself. Like when you're in a big group of people, it's usually more difficult to attain this state of consciousness. And you walk into the forest with this clean state of mind, and you just see what thoughts come to you. And usually sometimes they're not from you, but they come from outside. And so you have to build this sensitivity and this capacity to have dialogue.
that need to be solved or challenges that need to be addressed in order to achieve your goals, whether it's to scale or something else in the midterm like future?
So I'm going to start from nature's perspective. It really changes depending on the client, its mission, its objectives, the context where the food production is happening. In cases, for example, like coffee production systems, in Asia, you already have a lot of biodiversity in the way the coffee is being produced. So it's quite regenerative. There, the objective and the purpose of this is how to make it more economical and more organized, and while still respecting this nature-based approach, and by maintaining the set of practices that will benefit the ecosystem. Whilst in coffee production in a tropical context like Brazil, you have sometimes just completely open monocultures, and then the objective is quite different. So for each context, you need to develop the capacity building and the transitional packages that will be aimed at the specific objective for the specific context. But these are mostly either recovering biodiversity, restoring soil fertility, or improving economic resiliency, or reducing market risk. So in general terms, those are like the main objectives, and the challenges to scale those are usually, as Marc was mentioning, the workforce. So this capacity building is where most of the farm evolution goes to because of how complex it is and how long it takes. Usually a pilot project farm would be around 20-25% of the total cost of the project, precisely because it's highly knowledge intensive and it requires a lot of learnings to be scaled up. But do you want to complement on that? Challenges or scalability?
Well, as Juan Pablo already said, one is like really the context and the analysis of the context. But for me, it's much more the two challenges really are lack of machinery adapted to do intelligent work on the site and lack of trained laborers. So lack of qualified laborers. These two. Like in my reality, I live in this Alentejo, which nowadays is practically devoid of people in lots of areas. You see lots of areas of land to be regenerated, very little people, and there's a lack of people that really want to do this.
That's really interesting, and I think that's also a concept that is overlooked, that it's infrastructure that would be able to house people within, integrated fully with the ecosystem, so without damaging the ecosystem but actually restoring it. This infrastructure that invites people to live in nature, to learn about nature, is still somewhat lacking because we still haven't figured out how to do it. And it's projects like these that are asking this question about how to integrate fully with the ecosystem, but it also has to be based on how to produce food effectively, how to feed the ecosystem and restore it so that it is resilient. And then what is the relationship that human beings have with that in order to be a part of it and not create this separation from what we really are. So I think this point on infrastructure and also understanding of the connection with nature is still very much in development, and is something that will be required in order for us to like really integrate fully with the ecosystem. Yes.
Question specifically for this topic, but more from an economic point of view. Like, what is the additional yield that you can create in relationship to the excessive labor use, in terms of like how you could present it in a market surrounding like here in Portugal? Like, are people willing to pay this extra cost for the high quality, and what is the relationship between the yield that you get to the excessive labor?
So Usually, when we try to build economic models and business models, we try not to take into account the premium prices that these types of products will get. So it is actually without those premium prices that you have to structure these developments. So the point is that in integration, the resource use is way more efficient. The costs of inputs are reduced drastically because of the synergies that you're creating. So you depend less on the market to provide even the same or even better, as God's farm shows, productivity. So it's a strategy of reducing costs while maintaining or increasing productivity over time. Integrating it into space, so actually in less space it is highly more manageable than it would be if it's 5 times the land. So it is a cost reduction strategy and an optimization of resource use and land, sun, water, fertilizer, and labor, right? So when all of these things happen in harmony and in synchrony, then, well, really you tend towards an upward slope of profitability and resilience.
Including subsidies that you will get because you're creating a forest, part of
That's also in line with the premium prices. We try not to calculate this, but those are definitely in line, and governments and institutions are advocating for more funding for these types of projects. So I would confidently say that in the near future, this will be so necessary that, and the understanding will be greater, so that these public policies and these public institutions actually redirect these funds where they have to be. But it's important not to depend on those. If you have them, amazing. If you create a system where you can use carbon farming as a way of alternative finance, then great. But you should create a business model that is resilient in itself. And obviously with the added bonus that over time, the natural capital will have a way of being measured to the T, because of how important it is to us, and once we lack it, we're going to very significantly realize how much that will be in terms of cost. And of course, this is just monetary value, not even talking about spiritual and aesthetic and cultural, etc. But there are a lot of efforts in this direction as well. So it is also good to have those things into account. Yes?
You mentioned, I don't know what's your name.
Marc.
Marc? You mentioned that like the guy where you like were staying in Brazil, that after 30 years, that like basically within whole Brazil, it was like the part with the biggest diversity. Huh? And then you showed like this life cycle of like, I think like 600 years, and then comes the transition with like forest. So would you say that the most like vital and like healthy in a way like forest is like in a very young age, like between 30 and 180 years, and then it also slowly starts to decline?
Yeah, this is part of the case. In his case, it's also in the whole region of Brazil. There's only 3% of the original forest still remaining, so most of it is actually gone. And he introduced a lot more species in terms of plants, so that also accounts for higher biodiversity. And the higher photosynthetic rate and the higher health of his ecosystem is really largely influenced by the pruning and the maintenance that he does. And so, of course, like if you start getting really old forests and really old trees, they eventually start to stagnate.
But then eventually they can also fall and open.
Exactly.
But the process is just less optimized for human function. But it can be renovating itself over time.
Exactly.
You said like basically you're planting like a lot of seeds, and like in the beginning nature does the best job like on its own. The strongest one will like survive. But then like later on, like we as humans can have like a super awesome impact
No, from the beginning on, like in the beginning, like the life stage that this plantation is in now, this field that I planted half a year ago, this is like the part where you have the most maintenance. It's the part where you have the most, because you have a lot of little herbs and things that you have to prune in. And you also have to start selecting the trees, but always trying to mimic what would happen in nature. And as the plantation starts to get more mature, more developed, you start having less maintenance.
I thought you could just
Never.
So you get 3%, right?
We could, yeah.
Sorry, I think we have a question here. Somebody?
Another one, but someone else wants.
Here for the desert, which kind of trees do you plant for different purposes? So which ones are the ones that actually grow high, canopy,
There's a lot of different ones I plant for the different ones. I have my crops. I have the walnut as the emergent tree, or pecan nut. I could also have sobreiro, the cork oak is also emergent. Then for the canopy, I have olives, I have the azinheira, I have apples and figs and grapes, these plants. Then for the medium layer, I have, in my case, mostly citrus until now, but now I also want to start planting apricots. Medium to low, or low to medium, I have peach. Then for low, I put a lot aroeira, wild pistachio, Pistacia lentiscus. It's not a plant that has a commercial or edible use, but it's a native plant from here that grows underneath all the other trees. And one that I want to start experimenting as an even lower plant than the aroeira, the Pistacia lentiscus, is the mota, or myrtle in English, I think. Mota, yeah, that would grow like in the lowest part. Like if you see here, the plantation has here the rows of the trees. I would like to try to establish the mutas here in the paths. And then periodically prune them as well with the hedge trimmer or something.
how is the series? Like one of them grows higher, then the two canopies, one that grows lower. How is it?
The ones that grow highest are the ones that are most spaced out. But in the beginning, everything is planted a lot, you know. Like the walnuts, I put by seeds, and I put every 20-30 centimeters of walnut. The oaks, I plant by seeds. I put every 3 to 5 centimeters along kilometers of lines, acorns. And yeah.
Because not all of them will survive.
Exactly.
Then there's like a sort of natural selection as well.
Exactly.
And then you also create your input on optimizing this so that, as you said, the plants feel nice and have what they need to thrive.
Exactly. And for example, right now you see in all the rows a lot of poplar trees. That's like the poplars are the ones that are really doing good right now. Some of them already reaching almost 3 meters tall, 6 months after I planted them. I have a lot of tree from the Canarian Islands, which is called tagazaste. It's a leguminous tree that I see doing really well. I put a lot of eucalyptus. I put a lot of cypress trees. I put a lot of strawberry trees. A lot of ash. There's so many things that go into you.
You mean mulberry?
Who?
Mulberry.
Instead of what?
Strawberry. Strawberry is the one that grow on the ground.
No, here we have a tree called strawberry tree.
Really?
Arbutus unedo.
I know strawberries are the little ones.
Here we have one is called strawberry tree. In Portuguese, it's called medronho in Portuguese.
Madroño in Spanish.
It's called Arbutus unedo. The mulberry is Morbus alba, Morbus nigra.
Do you have a database of the frequency and types of trees that you've planted in your experiments in the local ecology?
I made one for my first field. Then for the second field, I was making a document of the design, and just to give you an idea of how my reality was at that moment. I would wake up at 5 in the morning to have 1.5 hours on the computer to write before going to the field to work the whole day. And I pretty much finished the document, but I never made the tables of the species. And then for the third field, I never did anything. I never wrote down anything.
You just planted.
But this is part of the process that you're in now, which is also monitoring and evaluating these experiments so that you know what can or should be scaled.
Exactly, exactly. And it's a process that's happening a lot from observation in my head.
Where do you source your seeds?
A lot of different places, like this whole place around here, this whole montado, is thousands of hectares around my farm, and it's a whole seed bank, you know, like there's a lot of things there that I can go and pick. Some specific species, I've identified certain hotspots for them. The acorns, I already now know in the, like in the 600 hectares around my farm, the estate on which my farm is, I already know all the oak trees that give the sweetest and biggest acorns. So there's like these more localized things, but then also a lot of things I source from outside of the estate. Some seeds I buy, some seeds I harvest from my neighbor. So it's a species that he introduced, this tagazastu, which I talked about earlier. It's really like the plant that on a short time frame I have the best results. Without irrigation, with irrigation, without manure, with manure, it grows like crazy.
Tagazastu?
Tagazastu. Citizus proliferus.
Are you introducing an invasive?
No, it's not invasive. No.
I was just curious.
No. I don't, there's one plant I have in my plantations that has a risk of becoming invasive, but as I do the maintenance of it, and it's not a tree, it's it's not a herb or a tree, it's something in between, it's a funny thing. But I never let it flower, so it doesn't make seeds.
Could you spell that tree one more time?
T-A-G-A-S-A-S-T-E.
Tagazastu.
Tagazastu. Yeah.
Are you completely self-motivated, or are you also working with other
What do you mean?
people? Are you completely self-motivated, or are you also working with other people?
There are like this first field I did by myself. The second one I made a planting event where I invited about 20 friends to help me plant it. And then that was 1 week or 5 days where these 20 people stayed, and we got really a lot done together. But then for the rest of the whole like seeding and making everything nice, it was still another 3 weeks that I spent with 3 trainees that I had from November until May. So it was 3 people that were there for half a year, and then they also helped me planting this part here.
How do I stay in the loop about traineeship and those?
Well, there are some communications that go through the channel of Regenerative about my farm, and then also my project has an Instagram page that you can follow if you want. No, it also has a Facebook page, but both of it is not. I don't do it myself, and the girl that does it, she sometimes updates it, sometimes not. It's not really like we don't really have a contract on it anymore.
And what's the name of the farm?
Of what?
Your farm, like
Quinta das Abelhas. Quinta das Abelhas, the farm of the bees.
And your Instagram is growback.
Yeah, it's _growback_. Yeah, _growback_.
That's what?
The Instagram page of my things.
It starts with an underscore?
Yeah.
I have a question on these species. I think these are invasive, but are not kind of naturalized.
Maybe.
Yeah, but it's cane, no?
Yeah.
Portuguese cane. Cana.
I don't know. I think it's more from the Eastern Mediterranean.
Okay. So, what are your views on this and in terms of biomass as mulch? Because these are extremely fast growing, extremely resilient.
They grow where there's a lot of water. If
Okay.
there's no water, they don't really grow. But you have the problem that they have really super strong roots, and the second you don't continue doing the maintenance of them, they will.
They expand.
Yeah, and you see here it's really close. The trees don't go through. Here you see this part. It was just as closed maybe 3 weeks ago, and I went through with a machete and I took out all the ones that were older, and the ones that I saw that were still growing, I left and I just took their head off at like this height, so that they would make lateral sprouts, so that they get renovated, and then they make a lot of shoots again from the floor, and then by the time that these shoots coming from the floor get bigger, I can take out all these ones. And so you always especially during summer, I think 3 or 4 times a week, so you open it up. I should maybe do it with these ones here as well. But the people from the region, they say like, oh, you have canas, like nothing's going to grow. You better just go with the tractor and take away all the soil together with everything else and just start from fresh. And the other one is the blackberries, the white blackberries. I have a lot of them.
Which you leave?
Yeah, and I used to plant them.
Was for fencing and for
creating mycorrhiza.
The what, sorry? Yeah.
For creating mycorrhiza. In some of my fields I plant them every 1 by 1 meters.